I'm going to mute. All right, people are starting to come into the room. We're going to give this a couple of minutes for more people to join, and then we will start today's webinar on apartheid and dispossession, views from the West Bank. So just sit tight for a moment. And welcome to viewers who are joining us from Facebook. We are going to start this webinar on apartheid and dispossession, views from the West Bank. In just a moment, we're just waiting for people to enter our Zoom room. Okay, we're very prompt here. It's 1 minute past the hour. I'm going to get started. If people join late, they can watch the video for the introductions. So welcome. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and I'm very happy to welcome our audience today to this webinar, Apartheid and Dispossession, Views from the West Bank. This event is co-sponsored with B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. I note that B'Tselem is also a partner and grantee of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and we're very proud to be holding this event with them today. Some housekeeping first. If you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A box. Don't put them in the chat box because I will not be monitoring the chat box, but we do welcome your questions, so put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to use as many of them as I can. This is being recorded and it's on Facebook, so heads up, you're being recorded, everybody. And we have enabled captions for people who prefer or need to use the captions. With that, I just want to, let's see, anything else on the housekeeping? No, so just to dig right into this. And I want to just briefly kind of give a lay of the land. So obviously, the situation in the West Bank is very much on the news screens today, a lot happening. Generally, the media picks up when something very sort of big, momentous, something that catches their eye happens. But the fact is, Palestinians face a matrix of mechanisms, and it's an ever-expanding matrix of mechanisms that are driven by settlers and by the government of Israel that are literally designed to remove them from their land in the West Bank, but also in Gaza Strip, in East Jerusalem, and as we're seeing these days, inside the Green Line in the Negev and Nakab. So today we're focusing on the West Bank, and we're going to actually be zooming in on Area C of the West Bank, where Palestinian communities live in literally an ever-present threat of dispossession at the hands of the Israeli government, its security forces, its courts, and its private citizens. Today's discussion will feature two Palestinians from Masafer Yatta in the South Hebron Hills, which is a region in Area C where the residents are under heightened threats and regular attacks. We'll also feature video interviews with other Palestinians living under threat in the same area. And importantly, this area in the South Hebron Hills is illustrative of what's happening across the West Bank, of how settlers and the Israeli government are working hand in hand to threaten Palestinians' homes, dispossess them of their land, and undermine their livelihoods and communities. So very briefly, we're going to get into this. I want to introduce our esteemed panel that is joining us today. And these are all people who are very, very busy on the ground every day. And I'm grateful and honored they have taken the time to be with us today. So first we have Basil al-Adraa. Basil is an activist, journalist, and photographer from the village of Atwani, and you can follow him on Twitter. My colleague will put his Twitter handle into the chat box. He is very active on Twitter, and also as a journalist, I encourage people to read him and follow him. Second, we have Eid, who is a photographer and activist from Masafer Yatta in the South Hebron Hills. And third, we are joined with two colleagues from B'Tselem, Sarit Michaeli, who is B'Tselem's International Advocacy Officer, and Eyal Hareuveni, who is a researcher whose new report is entitled State Business, Israel's Misappropriation of Land in the West Bank Through Settler Violence. And you can find all of their bios on our website, the long bios. So before we get started, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge terrible events that took place not long ago in one of the villages in the South Hebron Hills, and this is Eid's village, El Khair. in which one of the village elders, who was a well-known and greatly respected activist all over the South Hebron Hills, was fatally injured while protesting against Israeli harassment aimed at his village. So I want to send condolences from myself and from the foundation to Eid and to all the residents of the village and the whole community of activists, because this was really, I think, was devastating. So with that as the backdrop, Eid, first, to help frame the discussion today, could you start out by briefly laying out your community, the history of your community? Who are you? Where did you come from? How long have you been there? How long have you been in this location? And to the extent that you can, how has the situation of your community evolved over time from when it was first established to, with the growth of settlements and Area C politics?
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who is joining us. My community came from the Negev in 1948 as refugees. Jahalin tribe were coming to the West Bank, and then my family is part of it, and then we stay in South Hebron Hills until the 62, and then after that, the Israeli government, take over the West Bank, as we know, in 1967, and then we've been surrounded with settlements since 80s until today in Masafer Yatta, especially in al-Adraa village. We were located by Israeli settlement side by side, and they take more lands from the village, which own for us. And then after that, the harassment getting always more and more with years against my family, against the land, against the shepherds, against everybody who's trying to make living in which called Area C. I am Eid Suleiman Hedalin. I am an artist who live and born in al-Adraa village since 80s. I am grow up. I mean, my childhood and everybody, most of the youngsters in South Hebron Hills is growing up with with this mixable, type of settlers and military, coming every time to invade the villages and search them and, affected people, demolishing their homes, confiscating their lands. We all grow up with this. I mean, as a young people who witness this history along this, 30 years of settling in South Hebron Hills, especially in Masafer Yatta. And as a lack of that, any village is not allowed to have electricity or infrastructure in general. That's a really need for every village in Masafer Yatta, but it's forbidden by the Israeli government because they ask you a lot of papers and the plans. Then if you approve them, they reject them in the end of the day in the court. And that's, caused the people a lot to pay, even though they harassing them and they demolishing their homes every time. Otherwise, they arresting the people, they investigating the people, they take them to the jail for nothing, and they chasing the shepherds in the fields nowadays. And there is no more space for shepherds nowadays in Masafer Yatta because Israel control thousands of dunams of land and give it to the settler. I mean, one settler compared with 100 Palestinians. I mean, this is really very, very hard to the Palestinian community in Masafer Yatta in Area C. And that's caused us a lot as communities who live under these circumstances, like forbidden from infrastructures, forbidden from paved road, forbidden for building homes in safety. Everything is forbidden for Masafer Yatta communities, and al-Adraa is one of them. This is happened all over this, generations, and Israel never give a plan to make change or to make the people, to give the people some hope to make change. Even though we saw growth in the settlements, we saw development in the settlements, but the Palestinian communities beside, they're not allowed and forbidden from anything. This is the the major, thing which we talk about it in Masafer Yatta.
Thank you, Ida. I think that's a really powerful way to start this off. One thing that you said that I want to just emphasize for people to understand is the community that you're talking about is a community that started out as refugees from inside 48. And it's striking to me when I listen to you thinking that effectively it's almost an effort to take a refugee community and making it refugees again, which is just painful. Basil, I want to turn to you. Your community, Tuane, has been in the news a lot. There have been raids by settlers. There was just recently a raid by the IDF. I think I'll ask you about that in a bit. But before we get into all of that, can you also briefly introduce your village to our audience? How many people live there? Where did they come from? What is the source of their livelihoods? What is their relationship geographically and in terms of interaction to the Israeli settlements in the area?
Yes, so thank you. So my name is Basil al-Adraa from Tuani village. I should be like the neighbor of Eid, but between us since the 80s there is both our communities there's two settlements they were established there, and part of the strategy how to build settlements and outposts is to cut the connections between also the Palestinian communities, not just stealing their land and build settlements, but also to cut off the connections between those Palestinian communities. I come from Tuani village. Tuani is a bit different than Eid community in Khair. After 10 years of struggle in my community, Tuani, for example, we managed to get a structural plan, and we call it a master plan for our homes, and to get life requirements like electricity and water and paving roads and to build school. This came like to my community, and we went in it after long years of resisting and non-violent resistance against the occupation and its own policies, which is I wish and I fight together with Eid and other friends and other communities and other people here in Masafer Yatta to gain this win to all the communities. Despite of the situations that Eid were explaining, I said this about my community in Tuani because these small victories that we are making of a structural plan or removing the wall in 2006 from the in front of the village that were built by the Israeli army is still giving us some hope as activists, as people who's fighting against the occupation. We are like about 300 people here living. Next to us, there's a settlement called Ma'on, and beside it, there's an outpost called Khavat Ma'on. And like the resource of the people here in the life should be like the farming the land, but within the policy of the occupation by giving the settlers, not just my community, all Masafer Yatta, and all the in Masafer Yatta, originally they were farmers. We have sheep and we plant the land and we work in agriculture in general. But within these policies, by building settlements and expansion of the settlements and building outposts, and what started to happen last year specifically by giving the settlers what is called state land, which was stolen from us in the beginning of the 80s as Palestinians, and it goes from the state to the settlers to build farms and to allow the settlers graze there without the Palestinians. Palestinians are not allowed there, are not allowed to plow that land. So, for example, in Masafer Yatta, all the policies of the occupation by preventing people having water and destroying roads and taking their like agricultural land, give it to the settlers. In the year of 2000, were like about 100,000 sheep as a resource of life for the communities in Masafer Yatta for those families. And within all these policies by the past 20 years, now there is like 15,000 sheep. So the occupation policy here directly and indirectly succeeded by shifting people from being farmers to be mostly workers in the Israeli settlements and in Israel 48 by building and being workers instead of being like independent in their life and having their independent income. They're just workers for the occupation, and they always need the occupation for their life. So this is like another kind of policy and suffering that the people are under it here.
Thank you. That's really, again, a really powerful introduction to today's conversation. Thank you for that. Sarit, I want to come to you. You know, the lives, we've mentioned the term Area C a bunch of times, and I haven't stepped back to define it. And I want you to talk about this. The lives of Palestinians in the South Hebron Hills are defined in almost every single aspect by the fact that their communities are located in what is known as Area C, which is a territorial area defined under the Oslo Accords. Can you briefly explain what Area C is and how Israel's approach to Area C and its Palestinian residents has actually evolved in the decades since Oslo was signed? And I also just want to add one little factoid here, because both Eid and Basil talked about building permits and houses, permission to build. And today, an activist online, Itai Epstein, shared data from COGAT. This is from the Israeli authorities, which says that in the last 5 years in Area C, Palestinians were granted a total for 5 years of 33 building permits, while during the same period for settlers, there were 16,500 building permits granted. Talk about that.
So this is, I think, in response to a parliamentary question submitted by MK Mossi Raz, and this is in line with every single thing we know about the policies of the Israeli civil administration. So this is an, kind of like, if you need a factoid to put the entire picture in place, this is the one, and the fact that it came out today is just completely symbolic. Area C is actually 60% of the West Bank, but it's not a geographical area in a way, it's a political division, right? It's not some sort of organic place that has a history and it has developed in some ways. The location of Area C was drawn as part of the interim agreement signed between Israel and the PLO in order to kind of like find or locate places where Israel has established its settlements, so that in this kind of like then a defined process of a gradual changing of the control within the West Bank, this is going to be the last area to be discussed in the final status solution of the Oslo Accords, which was meant to happen in 1999, right? So this was not a geographic, not a demographic, but a political this division, very temporary, right? It was only meant to last 5 years, and it was initially already based on the Israeli policy of establishing settlements that was in itself designed specifically with the expressed view of fragmenting the West Bank and preventing any possibility of any kind of territorial compromise or Palestinian state, etc. So the Israeli initial decisions about where to place the settlements played a role in the decision of what would become Area C, which under Oslo then was placed under full Israeli responsibility, both security and civilian matters. Now, I should also come in and say for the record that we actually view this division as very technical and in fact not a realistic division, because Israeli policies in Area C affect all Palestinians living throughout the West Bank. But also, I think because, when you're talking about Area C, you forget for a moment that the Palestinians do not have any control over their lives and over who makes decisions about their lives and their future, even in areas A and B, right? The Palestinian Authority that ostensibly controls all matters in Area A and civilian matters in Area B is in itself, a kind of primarily a subcontractor of Israel in terms of applying the occupation. It does not actually have any capacity to make decisions that influence the future of Palestinians. But if we turn back again to the Oslo Accords, so Israel basically has all full control of anything that happens in Area C in terms of the way planning is designed, houses are given permits, and I'm sure it will not come as a massive surprise that Israel uses this control, this total control, right? There are zero Palestinians represented in the planning institutions, right? In the planning committees of the civil administration. It's a shocking issue, and we're only kind of not daily shocked by it because we're so used to the reality of Palestinians not being represented in any body that makes decisions over their future. So the civil administration makes decisions about all planning throughout the West Bank. It has provided a generous planning and permit regime for the settlements, right? They're constantly expanding, both settlements that are legal under the Israeli system and also settlements that are illegal under the Israeli system, and we'll hear about all of these outposts that supposedly are illegal, while at the same time, the Israeli civil administration utilizes its full control to restrict virtually completely any Palestinian development in Area C. And this is why communities like Eid's community, actually, Twani is one of the few examples of a community that is actually recognized by the Israeli authorities, simply cannot build legally, so everything they build is illegal and is also demolished, right? And is not, allowed to continue to exist. And I think if you look at the broad long-term picture, and this, I'll end with this, is you've seen during the 90s a slight, when there was a move towards, or extensive move towards a final status agreement, I think there was already then a move within the Israeli authorities of taking over this whole planning system. So it wasn't kind of like this innocent process, but certainly since the beginning of the previous decade, and even more so since about 2015, and certainly in growing numbers in the last few years, the civil administration is constantly demolishing and confiscating the homes and the properties and the livelihood structures of Palestinians, and at the same time, obviously, pressuring them. There is the kind of an internal dynamic within Israel that the civil administration is deeply committed to this demolition, this policy of demolition, but there is also a pressure from the Israeli right and the Israeli settlement enterprise to kind of like make it do its job even more so, including a lot of money that is flowing now into monitoring by settlers of Palestinians of these so-called illegal infractions, illegal construction that the Palestinians are perpetrating allegedly.
Thanks. And when we talk about illegal construction, we need to go back, I think, to that factoid of the day, which basically makes clear that under Israeli authority, it is virtually impossible for Palestinians to build, even on land Israel recognizes as private Palestinian land. It is virtually impossible for them to build legally. I want to get in now to sort of the situation, the day-to-day situation on the ground. And I want to preface this set of questions. My colleague is going to put a link into the chat. There was a recent article, was an interview with a settler named Yochai Damri, who is the chairman of the Mount Hebron Regional Council, which is the settler council for the area. And in the words of the journalist, this guy is arguably the most powerful person in that area, with the possible exception of IDF commanders. And it says in the article, he espouses an ideology according to which all Palestinians living on what he perceives as Jewish land are implicitly illegitimate trespassers. And in a section where he's speaking about residents of the South Hebron Hills, he said, and I'm quoting, "They must not only have their homes demolished, but also be placed in prison. They are small communities that must be taken apart." It's very clear, the intent and the policy there. So Basil, I want to come back to you. As I mentioned in my earlier question, we didn't touch on it yet, really. Your village was raided this week by IDF forces, which offers us an opportunity to talk about these raids. What are these raids about? What was this raid about? What are the previous raids that Twani and other villages in the area? And what is the legal pretext from Israel behind such raids? How do these actions by the IDF fit into the settler targeting of your community and its neighbors? And again, here I would quote that same settler leader when talking specifically about your village. He said that the residents of your village should have their homes demolished and be forced out. And he said, those who have stolen must sit behind bars and return what they stole. Speaking of your entire village.
Yeah, thank you again. Actually, the raid that happened before 2 nights in my village, where the army came inside the community as usual, and to be honest, in since 2021, like since the beginning of the last year until this 2 months of this year, we had at least 10 times the army raiding my community, my specific like 20 village during the night. Sometimes it were like it seems that they just come to show presence. Like before 2 weeks, I wake up because my father called me and said there's soldiers like near our home. I walked up outside the home. They just walk away toward the school. They were lighting inside the school. They spent like 15 minutes lighting inside. Then they went to the mosque of the community above it and then around some homes, and they went back inside Khabat Ma'un. And before tonight they came here. I got also a call from a resident that he said that the army is raiding their home and searching inside it. So I went there. Outside there was like around 6 vehicles of Israeli soldiers in between olive trees and inside the home and outside. Then they went out of that home, walking toward us. I was filming with another Israeli left-wing activist. What was happening? They just were masked, and for me it was really dangerous. We were like in a darkness place, and with like at least 20 soldiers, they start beating us. They took the camera. They tried to very hard to take my phone. And they were beating me up in my stomach and my head, and hit me to the jeep. But I managed to keep my phone and to run away. So I had short video of what was happening and put it on on Twitter. So what happened after? They just go arrested a 69 years old man and a young guy. They were like kept them in the army military base until the morning. They were taken to the police station. And what happened there? They told them that the settler claimed that they beat this settler before 6 months. This is like another way how they are using it as a techniques. When we as a Palestinians go claim, even with our evidence and our proofs, against settlers attacks that always happening against us, even like a pogroms like last year were taking place in my community, Twani, and the community of Mufagara specifically, and other communities across West Bank. It's like over than 90% of Palestinians doing complaints in the police stations. They will be closed and no one will be jailed from the Israeli settlers. In the opposite side, when settlers like give complaints against us, they shouldn't show any evidence and any proof. Directly, the army will arrest us or from the field, or they would come during the night, as what happened. It ended like the other day. They were just like in the police station for a few hours, and they let them go back like home. But for our home specifically, there was a raid by the Israeli secret intelligence before 3 weeks, threatening on the people to not do any demonstration and telling us that our community is doing problems, and always like when something happened. Specifically, they were worried that we do a demonstration after they killed the Hajj Suleiman, the icon of our resistance, in the South Hebron hills. So Shabak, which is the Israeli General Secret Intelligence, came to Eid community and to our community here in Twani and threatened on us After they left and do their threat, happened two raids in the night. This one that the guys got arrested, and the other one we think that it's just for showing presence and showing power that they are here and they can do whatever they want. Yeah, on the other hand, for example, me, I got attacked by a settlers in 2019. I have video, I have photo very clear of a settler with his face catching his dog and let his dog bite my hand. I did a complaint, but this file were closed in the police, in the Israeli police.
Thank you. Ida, I want to ask you also about settlers and settler violence, and specifically about the connection between settlers and the IDF. You know, both in terms of what we've seen on video so many times, you know, the IDF passive support, standing by idly and doing nothing, or even seeming to protect settlers while they are engaged in violence against Palestinians, or even what appears to be the IDF as an active tool sometimes of the Israeli government in support of settlers and settler attacks on Palestinians, and in support of policies that are explicitly designed to dispossess Palestinians. So the settler IDF connection.
Yeah, it's always clear for everybody the cooperation between the settlers and the IDF along these years. And we saw that in the field always. It's never been that the settlers, the soldiers come to stop settlers, even though they go to beat the Palestinians who've been attacked by settlers. We always saw that, even though the police, it's the most worst. I mean, the police supposed to be the law enforcement in the field. We saw it. We saw the police officers going with the settlers, you know, witnessing and stories more than coming to hear the Palestinian stories. Every attack happened in the field. You saw the police officers and the army came, managers and you know, lieutenants and generals in high degrees. They didn't come to hear from the Palestinians. First of all, they go with the settlers, standing aside and talking with them very much, and then not come to hear from the Palestinians. They come to arrest Palestinians. This is a problem. I mean, the cooperation between the settlers and the IDF is getting more and more. We saw the IDF like a guarding company for the settlers in the region of Area C. In terms of the army supposed to guard the borders of the state, the army used by the settlers as a security company, which supposed to guard the settlers always. Any settler, you know, grazing his sheep in the mountain, he's supposed to have 2 military vehicles standing with him all the day to protect him. That's insane. This is a lot of power, paying power by the Israeli military just to support and protect those settlers. Even though that, I mean, we saw a lot of demolitions happen against the Palestinian communities, and never we saw it happen against some settlers like in illegal outposts. It's never happened, and the IDF do it for the Palestinian people. Anytime the IDF came to any Palestinian community, they came with aggression, with beating the people, even though they didn't want to hear the people if they want to talk to them, I mean, generally or gently. They never talk to them gently. Always, if the settlers complain and call the IDF go and search all the communities about just to find one sheep, which maybe the settler lost it by himself. And then you saw the all brigade of South Hebron Hills is closing all the communities in Masafer Yatta and start searching with settlers. It's really, in the last 10 years, we saw a big cooperation with settlers and the military, which increased very much against the Palestinian community. And even though, which increased more, the army getting more radical and extreme more than 20 years ago. Their soldiers, you can't talk to them. Today we saw very young soldiers joining in the military service, and some of them as settlers, came from a settler house or a settler community. Let's make it all. I mean, it's really very clear that the soldiers doing the work for settlers. And this is very dangerous if it's going in this way along these years, maybe in future also. This is supposed to be known by the Israeli community, known by the families who sending their, sons and girls to serve in the West Bank or in Area C in general, specifically in Area C. Those families, they're supposed to know their sons witness a lot of crimes and they can't stop that. There's many attacks happened by settlers, and we saw the IDF soldiers standing and they didn't do anything to stop this kind of attacks against Palestinians. This has happened always. And this is supposed to be known by the Israeli, community and what's happening here behind the borders.
Thank you. And I would encourage people to take some time, and Basil's Twitter feed is a great place to start, to get a sense of what these videos are. I think for many years, Palestinians told the world this was happening, and people could rationalize, well, I didn't see it, I don't know, maybe it's not true. I mean, the video evidence now is incontrovertible. It's very clear what's happening in the West Bank, and that video is available. Sarit, I want to come back to you for a second. So I want to talk a little bit about the word apartheid and what's happening on the ground. And apartheid is obviously a word that is in the air these days. And the report that B'Tselem issued a few months ago, State Business, Israel's Misappropriation of Land in the West Bank Through Settler Violence, concludes with the following statement. I'm going to quote: "Settler attacks against Palestinians are a strategy employed by the Israeli apartheid regime, which seeks to advance and complete its misappropriation of more and more Palestinian land. As such, settler violence is a form of government policy, permitted and aided by official state authorities with their active participation." So that's quite a statement. Can you briefly unpack what B'Tselem means when it says that settler violence is a form of government policy? And can you also articulate how this overarching policy is one that B'Tselem views as apartheid?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the apartheid part of this answer. B'Tselem's position paper on apartheid, looking at the entire region between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea as one regime that obviously involves different practices, really looks at four Israeli practices that aim to promote the broad organizing principle, which is the principle of Jewish supremacy. And these are the takeover of land, of the entire area in different ways, citizenship, the freedom of movement, and political participation. And in this particular instance, this is primarily an issue of land takeover, right? The report we issued recently really sums up how settler violence is not some sort of, expression of individual criminality or something, these crazy hilltop youths who are running around rampaging, which is somehow what people would want us to think. It is a strategic tool. It's an official tool that Israel uses. Israel benefits from it and promotes it. We show in the report how Israel does it by essentially, first of all, allowing settlers to live in these areas, to take over these areas, funding them, supporting them. And then on the other hand, legitimizing the physical violence by settlers in these outposts that my colleague Eyal will describe in a moment. Now, I think it's really important to remember that violence is not some kind of random expression of the existence of these outposts in those areas. It's part of the business model of the outposts. And the reason I say it is because very often we think of, when we look at these instances, they just seem so shocking. They seem so removed from any kind of reasonable situation that a lot of people find ways to explain them, to deny them. Many Israelis, and Lara, you said this video evidence is incontrovertible. I would agree with that, but even our Prime Minister Bennett has made statements that minimize, that deny, that belittle the impact of settler violence, and this is across the board, the entire project. So I think it's very important to remember that the way takeover happens is through coming in with a massive amount of aggressive violence that is completely unchecked by the authorities, and as you know, our colleagues here described, in some cases literally assisted by the army and the different parts of Israel's security forces, and physically terrorizing Palestinian communities from accessing this land. And this is not simply only happening in Masafer Yatta, it's happening across the board throughout the West Bank, in the Jordan Valley, in areas in the eastern Ramallah region, in many, many areas. And in fact, only I think the day before yesterday, another outpost was established in the Jordan Valley to the northeast of a community of herders that we work with, called Khalet Makfou. Like, so this is just happening. This is happening in a very concerted and orchestrated way. It's supported by the state, in some cases funded, and the result is that Palestinians are basically know very well where they're not allowed to go, because the settlers have established either threats or physical violence. And the impact is essentially that communities that are dependent on this kind of like the whole and on herding and grazing and finding free food and water for the herds are locked into this kind of spiral of debt, because they're not able to access free food and water. So they have to constantly sell off parts of their herds in order to pay fodder merchants, right? Because they have to supplement the food that the herds are eating. So this is something we're hearing from our witnesses throughout the West Bank, and this is the essential goal of these herder/agricultural outposts. It's literally to scare Palestinians away from areas that settlers will then are going to take over. And in fact, Ze'ev Zambish, the architect, or one of the architects of Israel's settlement project, said it quite openly, that the agricultural outposts are an excellent way to take over land. They're like these space maintainers throughout the West Bank for land takeover.
Thanks. Listening to you, I remember, for years it has been argued that the settlement enterprise in the West Bank has actually not been super effective, because it's still not critical mass of settlers to take over the whole area. And I remember being out in the West Bank with my colleague Dror Etkes from Kerem Navot at one point, and him pointing to these farms, these agricultural settlements, as an extraordinarily effective way for a tiny number of settlers to take over a huge amounts of land. I want to actually take I'm sorry, do you want to?
No, I was just going to say, all you need is a herd of cows or goats, a couple of shacks, and immediately the soldiers will come, electricity will arrive, a road will be built, and all of this you can also then utilize in order to like build a little business. You bring some wayward youth from various places inside Israel, and you get subsidies for maintaining them, and you patrol the area. You get state funding for various activities to spy on your Palestinian neighbors.
So on that note, I want to actually take a break from this conversation. We have a couple of short videos from B'Tselem, which are testimonies from Palestinians on the ground, living in proximity to these farms. So I think my colleague Sarah Ann is going to run those two videos, and then we'll come back to the conversation. So.
اسمي صلاح نصر الله من قرية زنوتة. قرية زنوتة بتقع جنوب الخليل جنب مستوطنة شمعة. المستوطنة الزراعية كما المستوطنة عندنا اللي هي صارت عندنا من حوالي 8 شهور. أجا عندنا المستوطن اللي يسكن عندنا قريب من عندنا كثير. نبلش بخيمة كبر المسكن له بركسات، كاميرات، كشافات، بتلاقي الطيارة بدون طيار أغلب الأوقات في الليل وفي النهار. صوتها مزعج ومخيف صراحة، وحتى الغنم لما يشردن بنتشرن يعني من صوت الكاميرا هاي الطيارة. بلش ينزل عنا على الأراضي الزراعية، بلش يتهجم علينا الكلاب، بالعصي، بالمسدسات أحيانا. صار تأثير كبير بالنسبة للوضع الاقتصادي، غلى المعيشة، الأعلاف، بطل نقدر نصل للأراضي الزراعية اللي إحنا زرعناها، بطلنا نطلع من مرة صراحة في الغنم. إحنا مصروفنا من الحليب، من الجبن، من اللبن، من وين بدها الغنم تحصل على الحليب مشان نصنع إحنا هاي المنتجات؟ صارت المنطقة صغيرة بالنسبة لنا، بطلنا نقدر نطلع من مرة، وهي لحد الآن مش قادرين نحرث الأراضي اللي كل سنة بنحرثها بيطلع لنا الغنم مع الزرع، مش قادرين نحرثها ولا قادرين نصلح. أنا بظل بقف لما أشوفهم دخلوا المدرسة برجع الدار، لأنه بطل أمان من مرة صراحة.
All right, so that was one. I know we have another video. I don't know if we're going to show that one as well. I'm going to wait for 1 second. There we go.
أنا يوسف عمر جندية من خربة طوبة قريب من مستوطنة معون. قبل سنتين تقريبا صارت في مزرعة جديدة، وفي أكثر من تجمع للمتطرفين في أم زيتوني، جبل دوف، في خربات معون. الخوف منهم لأنهم متطرفين ودائما مسلحين. الغنم اللي معهم قلصت المراعي إن أكثر من 3 أبيار مي وبسق عليهم، ومنعنا إحنا نشرب منهم. يعني بيجيك على الأرض اللي بتحرثها أو بيجيك على الأرض اللي بتسرح فيها، بيقول لك هذا إيلو. بيجيب لك الجيش ويجيب لك مستوطنين ملثمين وهو مسلح كمان.
هايني يا حفيظ.
יש מקום שעברנו לידו, נלחצו, עשו בלאגן. יש איזה בית שם, צריך לבדוק אותו.
אפסים בבית? בבית?
تغيير كثير اللي بقيت تسرح طول النهار في تتنقل من جلدي لجلدي، أما أنا الحين خلاك في جلدي واحد، يعني بتزهق من الجلدي وانت رايح جاي معاها الصبح والمغرب في نفس الجلد. زدنا كمية الأعلاف، والأعلاف اللي بنجيبها مش كلها صحية، بتسبب أمراض للغنم وغالي كثير. الأكل اللي بنجيبه بده مصاري، منين نجيب مصاري إلا نقلص النعجات عشان الغنم الباقية تأكل. من كثر الاعتداءات ومن كثر اللي صار بطلنا في أمان في الخرب اللي احنا ساكنين فيه.
All right, so to get back into the discussion, I want to come to Eyal, who's been very patient. Thank you. Eyal, the recent B'Tselem report includes 5 case studies, one of which focuses on the illegal outpost. And when we say illegal, we mean illegal even under Israeli law. All settlements are illegal under international law. Even Israeli law says that the outposts, and this one is Havat Ma'on, which we just saw in one of the videos, Ma'on Farm, is illegal. And it's an outpost which the Israeli government has allowed to remain in place and has helped solidify in place despite being illegal and despite being a source of daily threats to Palestinians in the area, as we've just heard, including Eden Basil's villages. So in the recent report you wrote, and I'm going to quote, and I'm going to ask you to comment on this. You wrote, from the very inception of Havat Ma'on, settlers living there used violence to drive local Palestinians away from the pasture land and farmland they had used for generations. In the past few months, these two outposts have also begun setting up so-called farms. The violence, which continues to this day, consists of beating, including with sticks, axes, and clubs, stone throwing, riding horses or ATVs to scare and scatter flocks, setting assault dogs on shepherds and sheep, setting fire to fields, and cutting down trees. That's the quote. So can you unpack for us briefly how outposts like Havat Ma'on and the terrorism that emanates from them are supported by the state of Israel, including literally supported financially by the state of Israel? And can you talk about how illegal outposts like these and the violence in which they engage actually serve the broader Israeli goal of pushing Palestinians off their lands in these areas?
Yes, thank you. First of all, settler violence is part of the DNA of the settlement movement since its beginning, and it's been documented for decades by Israeli, Palestinians, and international human rights. When we are speaking about Havat Ma'on, and we are speaking about its illegality, all the buildings in Havat Ma'on were built without any permits. And the outpost is standing there for 25 years and nothing has been done about these illegal buildings. Whereas if you are speaking about the nearby Palestinian villages, if anyone would buy building materials, the next day the civil administration would come and confiscate it. And if anyone will dare to build anything, it will be demolished the day after. All these terrorist acts, the violence acts, it's not only threats, are made on mostly in broad daylight, when all the area is monitored by the army. Everything, almost everything is documented, and you can see the dozens, if not hundreds of videos that are documenting these violent acts. In most of the acts, soldiers are standing nearby and doing nothing, standing idly by. And even when the police is coming, the police doesn't do anything about it. If any Palestinian dares to go and complain to the police, most likely the police will interrogate him as a suspect. And not only that, all these outposts are being subsidized by the Israeli ministries, from the Ministry of Agriculture that gives subsidies to agricultural initiatives, from the settlements division that is supported, financed by the Israeli government, that finances any kind of economic initiatives in the outpost all over the West Bank, from the Ministry of Welfare that gives support to any kind of educational systems for the hilltop youth, from the Ministry of Welfare, from the Ministry of Education, from the Ministry of Defense, even from the Chief Rabbinate that gives them kosher certificates for food that they are selling. And it's been done for decades. There are all these outposts all over the West Bank. Havat Ma'on is a prototype for the agricultural farms that we have seen in the last 5 years that are being built all over the West Bank. These agricultural farms already control, according to Amana, twice as much as the built-up area in all the settlements. It's about 200,000 dunams.
I mean, sorry, to be clear, can you explain who Amana is, please?
Amana is one of the most important and the most effective settlers movement that is well connected with the Israeli government, and actually sometimes manipulate the government and sometimes even sets the strategy for this outpost. And in the 5 years, they found that the most effective and the fastest way to grab land all over the West Bank by just putting some shepherds with a few dozens of sheep or cows, few hilltop juveniles, and you can control thousands of dunams. And if they manage in 5 years and they are still building new agricultural farms all over the West Bank, they already controlled twice as much as the built-up area in the West Bank, and you can think within the next few years how much land they can control. And all this settlers' violence is being tolerated by the Israeli government and being granted immunity by the Israeli government and all its bodies. The army is there, doesn't do anything, even though the soldiers have all the authority and the power to arrest settlers who are acting in violence. The police is doing nothing. The Ministry of Defense doesn't do nothing. The Israeli court doesn't do nothing. The government doesn't do nothing, as Sarit says, and trying to belittle this phenomenon of settler violence.
Thank you very much. And I would say for people who want to look more into when you hear things like the settlers are not held to account, the cases are closed. I want to make sure people know that this is data. There's data on this from Israeli authorities that validate the analysis that virtually all cases are either not investigated or closed without any sort of indictment or trial. And that data can be found from B'Tselem and Yesh Din. It's breaking the silence. It's all out there. Ida, I want to come back to you and ask you to talk about the relationship between, again, the Israeli settlers and soldiers and your village, and we're talking about these farms right now in particular in your area, how you've seen that in light of your own experience and that of your village. How has that developed? And to the extent that right now the world is starting to wake up more to the use of the word apartheid, can you comment on how you feel, how that framing, whether it makes sense to you, and what, if it does make sense to you, what you think it adds to people's understanding of the dilemma of being a Palestinian living under all of these different mechanisms of dispossession?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, the situation is getting worse since 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, we have a lot of difficulties. We have a lot of harassment. We have a lot of land confiscations and so on and so on. The same thing happened 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But nowadays, when we compare the violence, when we compare the harassment and the aggression from this, three parts, the settlers, the IDF, and the police, against the Palestinian people who live in Area C, who live in their own land, in own villages, we saw it more aggression. The Palestinian simple person or simple farmer, he didn't see the future is bright or there's a light in the end of the tunnel. People just get frustrated. People is very tired, and the people is just say, we barely surviving nowadays in this life, which very hard from different type of things, like from the changing environment, and also the settler violence, the land confiscations, preventing Palestinians to go to grazing or plowing or working in their land. This is all come together as a complex and pushing the Palestinian people and to the edge. And the people who live in Area C seeing themselves, smashed between this and this, between all these political games which going around, and all this agreement which happened, 30 years ago, and nothing happened, just make it worse for the Palestinian people. All the Palestinian people, they know they are living in an apartheid system. They know that, everybody know that, because it is daily lifestyle today, the apartheid which going on here in the West Bank in general. We saw a lot of barriers, we saw a lot of fences, this road for settlers, this road preventing for Palestinians, and that's it. The problem is they want us to live with this status quo without change. That's it. This is make it worse for the Palestinian young generations to grow up, to grow in more generations in this status quo. It's really unbelievable here in the West Bank in general.
Thanks. And Basil, I think Basil is still with us. I don't see him on video. Yes, fantastic, Basil. So picking up on Eid's comment, and I'm struck by what he said at the end about the status quo. And I want to ask you to you have a lot of direct interaction with settlers, probably more than a lot of people would ever understand. You have a lot of direct interaction, and you have a lot of direct interaction with them where I think they probably convey to you what their views are about what they want the status quo to turn into, in terms of the Palestinian presence on the land, in terms of whether or not there is any respect for Palestinian rights as human beings, as landowners, as residents. And some of this is reflected in that article that I think we posted earlier from the settler leader. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on what the end game is for the settlers backed by Israeli policy when they're looking at the South Hebron Hills. Is it an end game of Palestinians living sort of squashed into tiny areas and passive, or is it an end game of erasure ultimately? You know, God willing, they all go away. And again, looking at that term apartheid, and how you feel that fits, because I mean, I know when I talk to people here in the United States about what's happening in the South Hebron Hills or in East Jerusalem, generally the response I get is, look, there's rule of law. Everything is legal. What do you want? And I think there's a profound misunderstanding of what using law to implement apartheid versus rule of law are. If you could talk about that, that would be terrific.
Yeah, all what we do here, it's illegal and it's against law. When it's the law, it's the occupation law. When it's these laws that we are not like we are violating them, is a law by an army. We are as civilians, as Palestinians, living since decades under the Israeli military law. We're civilians and living under a military law. This is not all people understand it, because not all people who easy for them to say, Palestinians build illegal, so the army come demolish it. Palestinians do illegal thing, because never their home were demolished, and never the army can just come into their home and arrest someone from their family, or take their cameras, or take their laptops for documenting the violations of the occupation. In the end of the day, me personally, I said law, and the law, I know that the law, it's a power. It's a power to control. Yeah, life, I understand life need laws and need people to respect the laws, but here we are under apartheid, and to those people should understand that the settlements and outposts are they are the illegal for the international law, for the human rights law, and their governments in the international community since decades just keep sending Israel condemnings and statements about the violating of the Palestinians' rights and the Palestinian human rights, and they always saying that they respect two-state solution. But the law that the army damaging our homes within it, and our roads and our schools, and allowing the expanding of the settlements and outposts, is the law that creating the facts on the ground, and the law that kicking us as a Palestinians out of our land, and as you said, as you mentioned before, that we are building, for example, our homes on our private land. And when a person can't build a home or a school for himself or for his community, can't build this building in his private land, where he can build it and where he can establish this thing, if he's not allowing to do it in his own private land, where can that happen? And it's very clear for us here. You said that, yeah, I meet like settlers many times, but the settlers all I saw and I interact with them, they're just extremists, and they just know how to use violence, and always they're backed with soldiers. And in different accidents, especially here in Khabat Ma'oun, soldiers who try to not back the settlers and try to prevent them. The soldiers themselves were attacked by the settlers. You know, the settlers, for me as a Palestinian, as an activist on the ground, they are part of this, the policy of the state. The policy of the state here in South Hebron Hills and all Area C, it's very clear by as much as they can kick Palestinians and Palestinians from this land, and as much as they can, the annexing of the land to the settlements, and like to turn it to a Jews' land, take it away from us. That's very clear by all the things and the reports you can see in B'Tselem, the media that we are publishing, the things we are speaking tonight, demolitions, our homes and our water pipes, our roads, within the settlers, like attacks and expansions and farms, the videos that you hear, it's very clear to squeeze us and to make our life hard as they can by making pressure. And Reid mentioned very important point. This, like for me as a Palestinian witnessing this day by day, it is the Nakba that's still going on, but with different technique, from going and killing people and demolishing their homes and evacuate them by forest. They're doing it, but by law, which is the law that legitimizes these settlers and this colonizing and this army controlling on us. In the end of the day, yes, all the things that we are explaining has one goal, which is to kick us as Palestinians living in Area C, where we are few Palestinians with more lands, toward Area A, which is the big Palestinian cities with so many people. So the land here can be annexed to Israel, or to be like Israeli settlements. In the end of the day, yeah, all the policy, all the things that we are passed on through the day, through the night has, and within like the army demolishing the settlers, it has one goal. Like you ask many time about what is the relationship between the army and the settlers. It's very clear when soldiers come demolish our homes, raiding our homes in the night, demolishing schools, preventing us to have life requirement. In the other hand, they are allowed it to happen in the outposts, even it is like illegal for the Israeli law. I never saw a demolition happening in Israeli outpost. So it's very clear apartheid situation, and has one goal, and the leaders of it is the Israeli army, Israeli settlers, Israeli police, within totally silenced by the international community, which is, I mentioned before, just keep condemning statements while facts are created on the ground by only the power of the law and the law of the occupation.
Thanks. And there's so much to unpack there. I want to actually ask you a follow-up question. And we've talked about this before. You're a human rights defender. You've witnessed and recorded and published for people to see really just incredibly powerful videos documenting what's actually happening, the human rights abuses, including against you, including the pogrom in Mufagara last October. And I think my colleague put into the chat box, you very graciously did a podcast with us about that at the time, what you experienced, and you've been personally targeted by the military for your journalism, for your activism. And I wanted to ask you, one of the things that Eid mentioned was this escalation, the idea that there's an escalation in the pressure, an escalation in the settlers' threats, an escalation in the tactics on the ground. Can you talk about what you're seeing in terms of an arc of activity, an escalation, and why you think this is happening now, and where you think it leads? You're muted still, Basil. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the thing we're like witnessed within like Corona pandemic, it's very clear when international activists were away from here, and we see the like, I think the world were busy with another thing, which is Corona and the pandemic, and find out solutions. We all witnessed that demolitions of Palestinian homes in Area C were increased in very crazy way. It is like 120% increased, I think, and settlers attacks also. And like in the end, they were using the time of like they were using the time that the world is busy with Corona and the pandemic, so they can do whatever they want. They're using the time that not much people focusing within the situation here, and especially with last year 2021, starting with this new idea of farms, like settlers are building farms. They are like 30 new farm across West Bank, at least 5 of them here in South Hebron Hills area. I saw a video of one settler talking that in the 80s they built the settlements, and then during the second intifada they connect each settlement with an outpost, and now the idea is to connect each outpost with a farm. And actually the farms policy is like some of the farms are taking more land than the settlement itself. And this is like for them, for the settlers, they're saying it's more and much way successful than the settlements, because it's less building, less money, less settlers coming to live in it. It's enough for each farm to have 3,000 dunums, preventing 5 Palestinian communities from grazing and cultivate the land there. Just enough like 5 to 7 settlers with 2 flocks of sheep, with their like motorcycles and drones and dogs and guns, like terrorizing any shepherd will come around that area, terrorizing the people, as we see, to claim that the people are stealing their sheep or they lost the sheep while they were grazing. So to bring like a heavy forces of soldiers and to go inside the homes and inside Palestinian sheep shelters to look for their sheep. So now it's like this new idea and policy of farms is really affected much. Eid mentioned before, and I am again saying it, it's very new policy and very dangerous. And the videos you watched, it was about it. And settlers themselves are saying it's more successful than the settlements that Israel start with it now, what they are doing. And for me, this kind of projects that they are doing by farms, for example, here next to Ma'on, they established a field of vineyard. I think this project cost millions of shekels, and that's mean in the past years they were like planning this new policy. It's not just something come up in their mind and they're doing it. It's a policy that they discuss it and they plan it with the big organizations and within the civilian administration, with the army, to take over the state land, to legitimize settlers taking this land and to build their farms and to plant them and to connect them with water and electricity and to build shelters and caravans and homes in this like thousands of dunums. So it is like they are like, as I said, they are like catching the power, and time to time they use when they want to increase. But mostly it was a long like process of planning these projects, like with money, with how they want to take the land, and how to organize it well with the army. On the other hand, yeah, I think they used the opportunity of Corona, that people are busy with the pandemic, so they used it.
Thank you so much for that answer. So we have 15 minutes left for a final round, and I want to come back to B'Tselem, and I'm going to just point this at both Sarit and Eyal, whichever you want to answer. B'Tselem's report ends with a real punch in the face, and it says, with regards to settler violence as a mechanism for land takeover, it says, quote, "The settlers are not defying the state; they are doing its bidding." So look, there seems to be growing attention to settler violence. There seems to be less attention to the connection between settler violence and the benefits that it brings to the state, and the connection responsibility of the state. So can you articulate why B'Tselem feels this connection is so important to make, and what you see happening in the international community with regards to recognizing and internalizing this state of affairs? And do you think the growing normalization, if not acceptance, of the apartheid framework in at least the global human rights organizations world, is a key step to people understanding and holding Israel accountable for these activities. And either one of you can answer that one. But one of you must.
Begin?
I let Eyal start and then I'll continue.
I think most of the Israeli political map supports the annexation of the West Bank. It's not a question of if Israel would annex the West Bank, it's the questions of when and how to do it. That was the situation about 1 year and a half. And this situation is affecting or reflects on how the army and how the settlers are acting upon it. They see it as part of Israel already, and everything is legitimate in order to achieve this goal. And when the prime minister does it, and when almost all the political parties support it, and when you see that the government and the Israeli courts doesn't do anything about the illegal, what Israel still calls illegal outposts for decades, why should the simple soldiers should do anything about it? And I heard a podcast 2 weeks ago with Nitzan Alon, who was the commander of the Israeli forces in the West Bank, left the army about a few years ago. And he said that if he wanted to act against settler violence, he knew that he had very few incentives to do so. He would encounter many obstacles from the political parties. He wouldn't get any support to do so. So that is the situation here for many decades. There's no incentive to do anything about settler violence, not by the Israeli official bodies and not by the international community.
Sorry?
So maybe I'll pick up where Eyal ended. I think, first of all, clearly, Israel incentivizes violence because it's very effective. It's an excellent tool to remove poor, disenfranchised, and completely powerless people from their land in order to take it over. So it's getting all the incentivization and no disincentives because there's no law enforcement. But I also want to talk about why we should not focus on law enforcement as this kind of like demand. And this is also, I think, very important from the international community perspective, because what we hear again and again from, for example, Undersecretary Nolan, that's just an example in her meeting with Israeli Minister of Interior Security, Omer Bar-Lev, is this discussion of settler violence and kind of like with a stress on arrests and kind of like criminal accountability, etc. I think that when the international community focuses on this part of the picture, so on just kind of like arresting and bringing to trial those responsible, which of course is important, etc., but not focusing on the deep state involvement in funding, in incentivizing, in making it all so worthwhile. And funding, and I think the funding is really the smoking gun in this whole issue, right? This is the deeply, broadly documented state support for these outposts. Then the international community is only going to be having a conversation about whether the police catches or doesn't catch these rampaging bullies, instead of how a systemic process has been going on for decades that aims to, be it through open action, through legalistic, I should call it, processes, or through actually overt violence, take over land. So I think this is really important for us all to remember. Another maybe point about the agricultural outposts, which I think that people need to pay attention to this phenomenon, right? And especially in the kind of policy circles in the United States and internationally, because I don't want to be an alarmist, but this development is really a quantum leap in terms of the ability of Israeli settlers to push Palestinians off of such vast land tracts throughout the West Bank that some of the communities that we work with are on the brink of collapse, right? People, I'm not even talking about the absolute utter suffering, daily suffering that people in much, much broader circles, right, areas are exposed to as a result of the expansion of these agricultural outposts. But the kind of like the economic deterioration and decline that people are dealing with. People who in the past were able to actually subsist and sometimes even thrive on herding and on agriculture are just having to deal with ongoing kind of like a shrinking of their space, right? They're, you know, as we heard in one of the videos, they're not even able to leave the kind of like the built-up area of the community, because they'll just have to face so much violence. So I think this is something that not enough people are aware of or are paying attention to, that this is a real threat to so many people and also to the existence of Palestinian farming and herding communities in these spaces, not just in the Southern Hebron Hills. As I said, the Jordan Valley is the most intense kind of like example of this dynamic as well. And I think when we think about these issues, there really needs to be a concerted international effort, not just to demand that Israel enforces the law, but to demand that Israel ends these apartheid practices and ends the state support for these, certainly for these agricultural outposts. This has to be the international demand. We cannot constantly be just kind of involved in these kind of cops and robbers scenarios. So this, I think, for us would be the essential messages that we would like to convey to kind of the policy crowd.
Thanks. And when you talk about the erasure of these communities, I want to remind people of the quote earlier from the head of the settler organizational body for the South Hebron Hills, who talked about taking apart communities as being a clear objective. So this isn't, it's not attributing intent falsely to suggest that that is actually the goal of the policies. Eyal and Basil, we need to wind this up, and I want to give you one more chance. So these are your last remarks, which you can use however you wish. I think this would be a really great opportunity for you to talk about what you see the challenges are going forward, and how you see the international community's role in supporting you, in bringing awareness to what is happening, in preventing the erasure of your communities going forward. Eyal, why don't you start, and then we'll end with Basil.
Yeah, thank you very much. We hope that the international community will concentrate on what's happening in the West Bank in general, especially in Area C, because the Israeli point of view just to clear more land from Area C from Palestinian, and then kick them away to Area A, which the majority of the Palestinian people. If the international community did nothing along these years, we hope so after the Amnesty International report, that maybe it will raise awareness a bit about what happened here, and maybe it's bring back the attention from the international community to the West Bank and what's happening inside the 67 borders, because it's really long these 2 years of pandemic. It's a bit forgotten a bit by the international community, and we hope so that it's a bring it back forward. Because I think when I look to the future, I think we will have a lot of difficulties in the future as we going on deeply in the years, because we saw Israel making this status quo and nothing push from outside real to make change here, not in a political side, not in sanction side, nothing. It's just going on with the settler, story and work, and the support for settlements is coming from different, countries from the world, and we feel it on the ground. After all these agreements between Israel and the Arab countries, we saw a lot of, kind of cooperation between Israel and these countries, and we feel that most of these projects funded by money come from abroad, which a lot of money. That's how come you make these projects, in 1 year for different settlements in the meantime. That's say it all. And we hope so the international community and countries who have the power to push Israel and back and look to the reality, what happening in the ground. This is which make change. Otherwise, it's nothing. It will be in the same, situation.
Thank you, Eid. And we've had a couple questions come up, and it's been raised in the conversation, this question of financing. And I think we should maybe organize a separate webinar just to talk about the way the Israeli government and funding coming from abroad is directly engaged in financing settlers and outposts and all of that. So folks on the call, heads up, there will be a webinar in the future. We'll look to schedule that. Basil, I want to give you the last word. I look to you often for guidance on what is most important that we should be paying attention to. And for a broad audience, I think this webinar will probably be listened to by people all over the world. I think this would be a really great opportunity for you to point people at what they should be paying attention to and where they maybe can get engaged.
So there's a lot of things the international community should do about this issue here on the ground. But I see it's more like, especially diplomats and governments, they choose if they want to do or they don't want to do. I hope they're gonna do serious steps against the occupation, against the apartheid, to end it. Other people like. The people abroad should be aware of what's going on here. Should listen to the right media and read the right reports that going and written from here, and be involved and stands for our rights. We need their help. We need them to protest. We need them to stop paying their taxes and their money to go to the Israeli soldiers, to the Israeli weapons, to the Israeli right-wing organizations whose their work and they're busy in just damaging our life, our homes, and taking over our lands. And I want to thank you for organizing this and thank the people who come to listen to us.
Thank you. And as we wrap this up, I want to say that for folks who are looking to understand what's happening, the most important thing you can be doing right now is paying attention to the voices on the ground, and particularly Palestinian voices, who for far too long have not been centered in this conversation about what's happening to their lives. I know if you look in the chat, you should have seen the Twitter link for Basil. He also writes often, including at 972. You should be following our friends at B'Tselem. There are other activists active in the South Hebron Hills. You can find these. If you start with Basil and start searching, you'll connect the dots between B'Tselem and Basil to an entire world of activists on the ground doing incredible and courageous work, trying to non-violently support the basic and human rights and civil rights of Palestinians on the ground. So I would encourage people to take the time. The more you know, the more you are empowered to speak up and to try to make change. We are running out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists, Basil, Eid, Sarit, Eyal, for taking so much of your valuable time to be with us today. I want to thank everyone who joined us for the video version of this event, or who's listening to it now online, or downloading it. We're very glad to share this conversation with you. Please check back at our website, www.fmep.org, for a list of the various resources that we shared during this webinar. Lots of fantastic links, and we'll be adding to that if there's more that we find. And thanks especially to people who asked questions. We worked as many of those as we could into the conversation. And with that, it is 1:29. I am finishing 30 seconds early. I want everyone to note that. We are so grateful for your time and for your work, and thank you for being with us today. So until the next time, Lara Friedman, the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.